Hi guys, Nightmares aside, this video is going to be slightly different to the regular format. I'm going to be talking about axles today on the Escort, mainly the Mark II. We'll cover a little bit about the Mark 1, what axles there is out there, what axles you should be looking at. And this is basically a compression of everything I've read over the last 5 years on forums. Just try to compress that into some usable information for you guys. You can take from it what you will. It might be useful for some, it might be utter garbage for others, but feel free to use it as much as you want. Right guys, let's just get straight stuck into it. The Escort Mark 1, Mark 2, made in various locations throughout the world, and depending on where it was made will determine what kind of axle it's got underneath it. Some axles were good, some axles were bad, and I don't know all the axles for all the countries, but we'll talk quickly about where the Escorts were made, and then you can see where you fit into all this. The Mark 1 had a build run from 1967 to 1975, was built in the UK in Dagenham and Haleswood, built in Saarlouis in Germany, Cork in Ireland, Nazareth, Israel, Homebush, Australia, Seaview, New Zealand, Taipei in Taiwan, and Genk in Belgium. The Mark 2 followed on from that. Clearly, started the run in 1974 and ran to late 1980, early 81. Only built now in the UK in Haleswood, still Saarlouis in Germany, Cork in Ireland, Nazareth, Israel, Homebush, Australia, changed in New Zealand to Wirry. Amsterdam came along for the Netherlands, and then Silvertown also for the Mark II in South Africa. And that's what mine is, a South African import into the UK from Silvertown. And we'll talk about what axle came with that car and if it was any good. So you can see by the fact that the Escort was simply produced in so many countries that it would make sense that they would all come with slightly different axles. Now, by no means do I know every axle under every Escort. I'm here mainly to talk about the stuff that was popping up on the forums and for the UK market, and now with the increase of the South African Escort coming into the UK, what the implications of that axle are. We're going to start here with the most popular axle that you're going to find, especially under a UK built Escort, and that is the English axle, referred to, strangely enough, in the Haynes manual as the Timken type. Now, Timken doesn't mean anything to me now, apart from bearings. Timken make very good bearings for these axles, but it is referred to as the Timken type. This axle was the most popular. It's very easy to identify in the fact that the diff carrier attaches from the front of the axle when the axle is in the car, and the whole diff carrier assembly can be removed with the axle in place, which makes servicing great. It's fitted to Mark 1 and Mark 2 UK spec Escorts. It was also fitted to some Anglers and Cortinas. It's a good axle up to 130 horsepower. I wrote 130 here, but reading through the rally preparation manual wrote back in the 70s, the axle is probably quite good up to about 150. And unless you're giving it pure stick and hard launching it every time, it could even maybe go up to 170, 180 without any major problems. But as I say, if you're giving it some stick, you're probably going to break it. They're relatively easy to build and fix, and the fact that the axle can stay in place while you remove the diff carrier. They can break in really high horsepower and high grip situations or applications. And the standard width for this axle is 48.5 inches, and that's measured from the outside casing of the flanges. Doesn't take into consideration the hubs, the drums, the discs, whatever you're running. It's just from the outside casing to the outside casing. And this was a standard width for unarched Escorts to be running up to a 7-inch wide tyre, referred to as a 7J. Moving on from the English axle, we're looking at the Atlas axle. Now, this was referred to again in the Haynes manual as a Salisbury type. No idea why, but it's more commonly known now as the Atlas. This one is quite easy to identify as well, although it can be confused with the other axles that are out there, in the fact that the diff cover attaches from the back of the axle. But it's going to be the same for the following axles from this as well. So we'll talk about the little nuances regarding the axles to make sure that you are getting an Atlas and not something else. But with the Atlas, the diff cover attaches from the back. It's fitted only to very, very few Mark 1, Mark 2 Escorts. It was mainly fitted to Capris, P100 Sierra pickups, Cortinas, and even transit vans. Obviously, depending on the application, will determine what length that the axle would come in, and we'll talk about the length shortly and what length you want, depending on what car you want to run. The Atlas parts are easy to source, or the axles are still relatively easy to source. Parts are very easy to source, as are upgrades. Properly built and properly set up with the correct backlash, they can handle high grip, high horsepower applications, and they can do upwards of 4,000 to 5,000 stage miles on a rally car as well before rebuilds. So they're very strong axles, and for fast road and general building to get you going, it's the best axle you want, really. It's the go-to axle for rally enthusiasts, and the size depends on what axle, where the axle came from, and as I say, we'll talk about that shortly. So moving on from the Salisbury and the English, we're looking at the Clone axle. Clone, I'm not sure if it's pronounced Clone or Clone. It was built in Cologne, Germany, but I like to call it the Clone axle because it looks very, very similar to the Atlas axle. There's a few little nuances regarding the bolt pattern, which we'll talk about shortly, which differentiates it. But the Clone axle was mainly built for Mark 1, Mark 2 Euro spec Escorts and Cortinas. The diff cover attaches to the rear of the axle, so that's why I say it looks like an Atlas and can be confused by an Atlas. And I've even seen adverts on eBay of people trying to sell these as Atlas axles. So you need to exercise extreme caution if you are in the market for an Atlas axle, that you don't pick up one of these by mistake. Conversely, if you do have an Atlas, or you had an Atlas with the car, or you bought a car with an axle attached and you think it's an Atlas, pop your head under, and you might be surprised. It's a great axle for nipping your grand to the shops, but that's about it. It wasn't a high performance axle at all. Because of that, the spares are quite rare, as are the upgrades, including the limited slip diffs. I didn't come across any actually that were for sale for a Clone axle. They can brake in high grip, high horsepower applications, and similarly they can also brake in low grip and low horsepower applications. They can just brake. They're not built for serious abuse. So if that's what you've got in mind, then you want to steer away from this Clone axle. Size doesn't matter, again, because if you are trying to fit one of these, it's probably too late for you. As I say, it's not a performance axle, so unless you're building a concourse restoration, then this isn't really the axle for you. The back cover has a slightly non-symmetrical bolt pattern and flatter sides, and I'll talk about what that means in a second. Moving on, we've got what I have, which is a South African Borg-Warner diff, Johannesburg M68. Now that's what's kind of printed onto the side of the axle. I don't think Borg-Warner made the axle itself. I think that's just a diff inside, but that's what it looks like. The diff cover attaches to the rear of the axle again. It was fitted to Mark 2 South African Escorts. I wrote Mark 1 here. I don't even think they made Mark 1 Escorts in South Africa, so that's a typo. It's a good axle for cruising the savannah. Again, that's about it. Spares are rare and very limited upgrade options, including the LSDs. They can brake in high horsepower, high grip situations. But saying that, mine has survived 35 years of being caned around South Africa. It doesn't look like it's ever been rebuilt. It's in disrepair. The backlash is measured in days opposed to thousandths of a mil. It's not in great condition and it whines like a trooper, but it still works, and I imagine it's not had anything done to it from day one. So they can work. It's not a performance piece. It's identified by its iconic octagonal diff cover. So the back of the axle, as you look at it, it looks slightly like kind of a 50p shape. It's got 8 specific flat sides. So it's very iconic. You can definitely see one of these axles from a mile off. And again, the size of these is 48.5 to go under an unarched Escort, but you don't really need to be asking because you don't really want to be fitting one of these. Again, unless you're doing a restoration and you want all genuine parts, then it's not the axle for you. It's not. So, looking now more closely at the Clone axle and also the Atlas, because as I said before, they are very similar in shape and size. They look the part, but one of them is the one you want and one of them is not the one you want. Starting with the Clone, it's got a diff cover attaches from the back, as I mentioned, but it has a slightly non-symmetrical bolt pattern. You'll see here the 2 bolts at the top and the bottom are slightly closer here and here, and that gives it this non-symmetrical look. and it also has slightly straighter sides on the side here. And just generally looking at it from behind, it looks a little bit drunk and a little bit wonky. If you are looking at it and you just can't quite put your finger on why it looks badly made, then it's probably going to be this clone axle. It just looks a bit off. Conversely, the Atlas looks a lot better. Again, the diff cover attaches from the rear. The back cover is actually round and the bolt pattern is symmetrical. The back cover may be upgraded already, like on mine. You'll see a picture here. I've got like this, it's like a Watts cover, but it's also got this integrated kind of cooling fans on it as well. So you may see that. That's a dead giveaway that it's an Atlas. I don't think they're making these diff covers for any of the other axles. So if you see that on it already, then you know what you've got. And if the axle is connected to a car, the owner is going to tell you it's an Atlas for sure. If anyone's got an Atlas, they're very proud of the fact they've got an Atlas, and they'll tell you. So that's it. That's the main differences between the clone and the Atlas. And you do need to exercise caution, as I say, because I've seen people trying to sell these clone axles as a copy, especially if you're on kind of foreign websites and you're trying to import parts. These clone axles were very common in Europe, not so much in the UK, but they are becoming more commonplace now. Now that cars are being imported more readily. Moving on, the only options, I'm afraid, if you've got a clone and a Joburg, in my opinion, is option A, you can skip it. Option B, you can upcycle it and put a lampshade on. If your missus will allow that, you can put it in your living room or your garage, wherever you want. Or option 3, which is what I'm doing, is waiting for November, 5th of November. We'll chuck it on a bonfire and watch it burn. So guys, I'm going to call it a day on this recording. I'm already up to 13 minutes here. Way longer than I envisaged, and I still have quite a lot to talk about regarding axle widths, offsets, and how to choose a custom axle for your car. So I've decided at this stage I'm probably going to split this into 3 parts, maybe 4. We'll see how we go, 3 or 4 parts. So we're going to call this a day at part 1. This is just going to be axle identification. If you like the content or you're interested in the rest of the videos, then they will be up very shortly. But until then, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you soon. Stay safe.